Lastly, I just want to say that this session poses difficulties because, as we've all studied in the Chavruta, those of you who are with us, the categories and languages and grounding assumptions of the Torah and even of Chazal may not be our own. And consequently, the session isn't only about gender or sex, but it is about how we use these resources in order to shape halakha and psak halakha in specific. We trust that you find this study challenging, also enriching and thoughtful. And with this, I thank Rabbi Katz and invite him to lead us in the limud.
Again, Steve, thank you very much for the introduction. And for those who have joined us now after the Chavrusa, like I said last week, like I said earlier, of course, first and foremost, potchim b'chvod achsani, as the rabbis teach us. You really have to thank the hosts, in this case, the HL staff, particularly Steve and Miriam, for giving me this wonderful, wonderful opportunity to learn and study Yasher Koach. I approached this shiur tonight with a reflection on the Gemara in Shabbat, when the Gemara in Shabbat talks about Gilu Bir Ada. One can have mixed feelings simultaneously when they're filled with joy, but also overwhelmed with trepidation. Gilu Bir Ada, you're joyful, and you also have fear and Yirat Shamayim. And I'm privileged that I have this opportunity to teach this wonderful community on this topic, but also I'm filled with anxiety and trepidation and fear for saying the wrong thing. And that is true. That is true, that you can err on either side. You can make a mistake in one way or the other. And that kind of raises a lot of fear. God forbid that you should hurt someone unnecessarily or say the wrong thing. And having said that, I want to kind of also start out with an a priori asking of mechila, asking of forgiveness, as Steve so rightfully said and rightfully articulated. These are very complicated and very personal issues for a lot of people. As I said last week, it's almost a chutzpah for me, Mr. Privilege par excellence in Judaism, to even think that I can kind of check in. I'm white, I'm a Kohen, I'm heterosexual, I have payas, I learned Satmar. I mean, it doesn't get more privileged than that. So I will never ever know what it's like to live in a community that is doubting your first principle space. So I hope I'm as careful and as sensitive as can be, but I recognize that someone can never ever be sufficiently sensitive and sufficiently careful, and therefore I a priori ask mechila. And with that, I'm going to get started at the shiur. Like I said, like Steve mentioned, we're going to be muted for the shiur, which will go till around 9 o'clock. If you have a question, please write it in the chat. If I can respond to a question, particularly if it's related to the presentation, then I will definitely try to answer it. But if not, then definitely during the question and answer period, we will have a chance to really go through the questions. So without further ado, let me get started. And like I guess the last thing I want to say, and I'm sorry for so many preliminaries, is, as I said before, there are two questions when we discuss this issue. One is the if, and the other is the when. In other words, the if question is, can one surgically alter their bodies? Is there a halakhic issues? And that's a big question, but I'm not going to touch that question. I'm not going to touch that question at all. I'm coming into the conversation post facto. If someone transitioned, and that can be surgically, hormonally, or any way possible, what is the status of someone who was assigned a sex when they were born, and as time went on, changed from their assigned sex when they were born? That is going to be the question that I'm going to try to explore tonight. So let me get started. Just not sure why my screen is not cooperating. 1 second, let me just, not sure what the problem is. Bear with me just for 1 more minute. That works. Just a second. Okay, yeah. So let's start with framing our tonight's conversation. What are we asking? What are we trying to figure out tonight? What is it that we want to answer? Well, here is the question that we're trying to answer. The question we're trying to answer is gender transition halakhically valid, right? And that's very simply put, when one transitions from one gender to the other, does halacha recognize and accept that transition as effective and binding on the tradition, right? Now, why does it matter? For what are we asking the question of whether it's valid or not? So it's important to recognize that there are three tiers of relevance that when we're talking about this question of whether transgender transition is valid, right? Tier number one is an easy one, right? Mechitza and similar questions, right? If someone was, assigned male when they were born and then transitions to female, which side of the mechitza do they sit in? And when is it considered kind of a halachically valid transition for mechitza? So that's a low burner kind of question that we're asking. Tier number two, which is a little bit harder, is when it comes to gender-based mitzvot, right? Whether it's the right or the rabbanan, right? Halacha is heavily gendered, right? There are male mitzvot, there are female mitzvot, there are mitzvot that only women are obligated, there are mitzvot that only men are obligated. What happens when one transitions from one to the other as regards these mitzvot, right? A simple illustration would be tefillin. What happens to someone who was assigned male at birth, then transitioned to female? Are we able to say they're exempt from tefillin, or vice versa, right? What happens when someone was assigned female at birth and then they transitioned to male? Are we able with integrity to say they are halachically obligated to put on tefillin? And remember, putting on tefillin as a woman is by way of not a serious problem. We can talk about that another time. But are they obligated? Is it legitimate to say it's a mitzvah for them to wear tefillin? And then finally, the hardest tier, so to speak, the hardest level of the question is capital matters, marriage and the like, right? Halacha does consider gender when it comes to marriage, male, female, and so on and so forth. What happens when someone transitions vis-a-vis the marriage issues, the marriage questions? Yes, I know that the sources don't talk about that. I'll explain that. So that's the framing of kind of what we're talking about. Is it valid? Is it valid for mechitza? Is it valid for gender-based mitzvot? Is it valid for capital matters? And then I had you kind of ponder the questions. I guess every time I open the chat, it interrupts it. So I guess I have to put it down again and then open it. I guess I can't open the chat then while we're speaking. I apologize. But when the minute I open the chat, my screen freezes and I cannot continue. So let me try this again, and I will look at the chat only when we're done. Okay. So as I gave you the questions in the chavrusa, hopefully you had a chance to talk about that, right? When we want to break down the questions, here is what the questions are. Question number one, does halacha even acknowledge the premise of gender, or is sex, in other words, physiology, the only thing that determines separates men from women, right? So we in contemporary parlance, in contemporary nomenclature, talk about gender and sex, and those are different things. Maybe perhaps for halacha, all they know is sex. And then I apologize in advance tonight, I'm going to use a lot of graphic language. If you have a penis, you're a man. If you have a vagina, you're a woman, and that was it. That's question number one. Question number two, if in fact halacha does acknowledge gender as a category, halacha does know sex and gender are not the same, then what determines one's gender? How is it determined? Physiologically, based on various limbs, various body parts? Hormonally, is it estrogen or whatever it is? Or is it based on self-perception? Right? That's the three possible ways one can determine perhaps gender. Is it determined by the kind of body the person has? Is it determined by the hormones? Or is it based on how people feel in their innermost, deepest self? And then, of course, that follows the next question, which is, once we've determined which one it is, what happens if it's physiological? So what happens if you change your physiology? What happens if ceremonially? Is it set in stone from the day you're born or no? Okay, it's physiological, and based on whatever the physiology is at any given time, that would be that person's gender. In other words, is it set in stone? Is it permanent, or can it be changed? And then as a side issue, but a relevant issue, is the role of text and the authority of text, right? As I'm sure many of you know, right? Traditional texts are divided into halakha and Agadah, and the simplest way to translate Agadah is any non-halakhic texts, right? They don't directly discuss halakha. What's their status? Do they have authority? Do they not have authority? Are they valid? Are they not valid? What's with Kabbalah? Are they valid? Are they not valid? Can we kind of argue, look, Kabbalah said XYZ, therefore the halakha is such and such and such and such. So those are the questions that we're going to kind of be exploring today. So, as I said, traditionally, if you're a traditional rabbi, you would open the bookshelf, right? You would go to the bookshelf and start looking for sources. There is no source other than one esoteric text that addresses the question of gender transition. And I'm talking earlier texts. Obviously, in the last 50 or 60 years or so, we do find people starting to address these issues. But when you go back a little bit earlier, there is almost no source except for this very odd source that we actually looked at last week in a different context. But this is, Ms. Rabbi, I think, one of the earliest sources that talks about gender transition. Second, there we go, right? So this is the Ibn Ezra, but she had in the Chavrusa. I don't know if you had a chance, right? The pasuk says, a man should not be with another man like a woman. Well, a man cannot be with another man like a woman because a man has a penis, not a vagina. How is that possible? V'yomar Rav Chananel Zal, so the Ibn Ezra quotes Rabbeinu Chananel, who says, Ki yesh mi sheyachadesh begufo ketzurat basar isha. It is possible for someone to renew their body, to create their body in the way of a woman. So presumably what he's talking about is someone who has transitioned physically, right? Yechadesh begufo ketsurat besar isha. Now, is he talking about surgery? I mean, is it really possible? We're talking about 9th, 10th century. Was Rabbeinu Chananel aware in 9th and 10th century about someone who surgically alters their body from male to female? It's a little hard to believe. Is he talking about someone who contorts their body into kind of a female, which we know, kind of Madame Butterfly or other examples? Is that what he's talking about? It's not clear. What is clear, though, is that the Rabbeinu Chananel considers that person male, right? Because the Rabbeinu Chananel says, when the Torah says two males, when the Torah discusses two males being together, how is that possible? When one of the men made their body into a female body, right? When one of the men has a vagina, and it's still considered two men being together. So it would seem that Rabbeinu Chananel assumes that altering your the privates, the genitalia of a person, does not change their status. But again, we're left in the dark here because we're not sure what exactly he's talking about. In fact, the Ibn Ezra, in typical Ibn Ezra fashion, says, that's impossible. There's no such a thing. It's not something that can happen. So we're kind of doomed. There really is nowhere to look in order to try to figure out what is the halakha about gender transition. And like I said, the only solution is to go to secondary sources and see whether we can squeeze out from there answers to our question. And that's where I think that a question can be answered by looking at the sugya of androgynous, right? Androgynous is more or less translated as person who is intersex, right? They seem to be having dual genitalia. right? They seem to have a penis and a vagina. That's an androgynous, and that's the person that the rabbis do talk about. In fact, not only do they talk about it a lot. In fact, I mean, some of you might know there's an entire chapter of Mishnah in Masechet Bikurim, which I'm not going to talk how it ended up there, but in Masechet Bikurim, there's an entire chapter of Mishnah, and as you can see, there's multiple versions of that Mishnah. There's the traditional version, there's the Rosh Hashanah's version, there's the Graz version. It's really a very elaborate chapter of Mishnah that discusses androgynous. And that is in addition to the pages of Talmud that talks about androgynous, which, by the way, this is just kind of as an aside. To me, this is always fascinating because the level of interest seems to be disproportionate to the level of encounter. It's hard for me to believe that a rabbi's encountered, people who were intersex on such a frequent level to make them involved in this question so much. So I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer why there is a disproportionate focus on the question of androgynous, but there's a lot of discussion in the Talmud about androgynous. So let's unpack androgynous for a few minutes, and then we will see how that plays itself out into our question. So, okay, what is the gender status of an androgynous, the intersex person? What are they in halacha? So, as we know, as many Jews, that how many opinions there are. Some poskim say that the androgynous is considered a male. Some poskim consider the androgynous female. Some poskim say the androgynous is a suffix, right? And they live in this halakhic limbo for their entire lives. We never know what they are and how to treat them halachically. Are they male or female? There are those who say, guess what? Maybe there is more than two genders in the Torah. There's male, there's female, and then there's another gender, and perhaps another gender, and another gender. So when people tell you there are only two genders in the Torah, tell them they're outright wrong. There is a Gemara in Yevamot that talks at least about a third gender. What that means in terms of halakha is a little complicated, right? If we're saying this person is neither male nor female, they're their own category, what happens with gender-based mitzvot? How do we decide what to do in terms of those mitzvot? A question we'll leave for another time. Now we come to the more complicated opinions. There is an opinion that says that a intersex person is a, so to speak, half and half. They are male and female, half that, half that. I'm not sure exactly if half means 50%, the right side of the body is male and the left side of the body is female. Is it the upper part of the body male and the lower part female? I'm not sure exactly how to play that out, but there is an opinion, the Ravad, an early opinion of a Provençal Rishon, 12th, 13th century, who says, oh, it is half and half. And finally, this is the most important one. This is the one that we're going to come back. This is the Magen Avraham. This is an 18th century scholar who attributes it to the Rif, who is the Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi from the 10th century Morocco, which is incorrect. There's no such Rif, but the Magen Avraham believes that the intersex person's gender oscillates. They shift back and forth. There are times when they're male and there are times when they're female. So those are most of the opinions. This is not exhaustive, but those are most of the opinions of androgynous. And the question is, so what? I mean, okay, what does that have to do with our question? How does that implicate the discussion that we're having? So here's how it does. Either way, based on the discussions about the intersex person, one has to conclude that gender in halacha is physiological. That's the answer, right? Why does the androgynous pose a problem for halakha? Why do we not know what their gender to be? Because physiologically, they are confusing, and gender is physiology. To be blunt, a penis is male, a vagina is female. So if a person presents with both body parts, that poses a problem. So that's a given. That seems to be a given that halakha determines gender based on physiology. But that raises two questions. And here are the following two questions. Number one, Is it siba or siman? Now, let me elaborate on that a little bit. If you're a yeshiva, bacher, or woman, then you've encountered this term, right? In halakha, there is a category which is called siba or siman. What does that mean? Let me give you a very simple example. What determines night? How do you decide whether it's night or not? You look for 3 stars. Now, here's the question. Are the 3 stars siba? Are they cause for night? How does it become nighttime in halakha? 3 stars turns the day into night. That would be siba. Or is it siman? Siman would be translated lightly as symptom, right? It's not the stars that make night turn day into night. The stars are symptomatic of something other, which is it's a symptom that it is night, right? So we can ask the same question with our Gemara. Is physiology cause or is physiology symptom, right? Is it because someone who has a penis is male and someone has a vagina, they're female? Or no, if someone has a penis, that's the physical evidence that they are male, but that does not make them male. Why is it relevant? Well, it's very simple. If we're saying it's siba, the body part determines your gender, then, so to speak, okay, the body part determines your gender. But if we're saying the body part is evidence of gender, then we can start asking what happens if we have very strong evidence counter the physiology, right? What happens if someone presents as male, let's say, and hormonally they're female, or even they say, I feel female. So you can't tell me that the penis is evidence of male when I know I myself feel female. So that's the big question that anybody dealing with the question of transgender, this is the question that they need. These are the questions, I should say, that they need to answer. Right? Is it siba or siman? And so that's essentially the question. So let's answer that question. Here's the other question we need to answer. If it's physiological, right? If indeed it's true, look at the sugya of androgynous, body parts determines a person's gender, right? If then the question is it physiological and permanent, or is it physiological and then it can be altered, right? That's kind of the first question we need to answer. The sugya, the Gemara in Androgynous has established that physiology determines gender. Let's go with that assumption for now. But does it mean the physiology you're born with is permanent and inalterable? Or no, fine. If you have a vagina, then you're female. And if you change that and now you have a penis, then you're male because you have a body part of a male. In other words, is it set in stone or is it something that can be altered? In other words, what's the status of surgery in halakha? That's the question poskim have been asking up until now. Like I said, if you look to earlier Rishonim, you won't find anything on transgender, but the last 20 years or so, there has been extensive discussion about this issue. In fact, there is a very interesting sefer, which I can talk about another time, Dor Tahapuchot, a full book dedicated on this question. Other people have talked about this issue, but primarily the question that they're asking is whether surgery is valid in halakha. Can surgery alter your assigned gender? Here's the problem. Like everything else in halakha, it's a split. Some people say, yes, of course it's physiological, but it is the physiology that you have at this moment. And there are those people who say, no, it's set in stone. It is determined by the physiology you are born with. Whatever physiology you're born with, that's your status, your gender status. I have to say, to the degree that I was able to find, and I did search high, low, far, and wide, anybody who talks on this issue, I have not found anybody who brings a solid, compelling textual proof to their opinion one way or the other. Either side, the yes side or the no side, really kind of speaks out of a place of secondary or tertiary impressions of what they think the halacha is or should be. I am not aware of any compelling proof one way or the other, really, in terms of text. But that's the state of the union at the moment. This is, so to speak, where I try to come in and move the conversation a little bit further. As I mentioned in the beginning of the evening, before Chavrusa, I've spent a year exploring this topic. I'm wrapping up a tshuva slash monograph on this topic. It's up to 60 pages. I think it was probably by the time I'm done, I'll be 70 pages long. But this is kind of the background that one encounters when one needs to explore this issue. And henceforth, going forward, I'll share with you what I think can move along the conversation. So here is, first of all, number one. I think that even if we'll assume that gender is physiological, right? That a body part determines a person's gender, a penis is male, a vagina is female. When one alters that, then that's what they are currently. And if they switch from female to male surgically, they're male now. If they switch from male to female, they're female now. How do I know that? That's a text that I want to share with you, which again, as I said in the beginning, it is a stretch. I hope I can convince you that this text is indeed proving the fact that when it comes to gender, we are deciding the person's gender status by what we're encountering presently. So let's take a look. This is a very important text of Rabbeinu Yonah. I translated it for you in English in the Chavrus and the sheet. Long story short, there is a thing called musk. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but the Gemara talks about musk. What is that? So Rabbeinu Yonah, who is a 12th, 13th century Spanish scholar, writes as follows. V'hanachon yoter, V'hanachon yoter, what is musk? Shechaya yeduahi, it's a very well-known animal. I don't know what it is. Sheyesh lo chatotrot betzavar, it has some kind of pouch in its neck. Ulesham mitkabetz mitchila ke'endam, some of the non-kosher animals' blood, some are concentrates in that pouch, but that pouch is kind of like a stomach. It digests the blood, so that the blood transforms into something new. Musk. That's what musk is, right? So let's remember, musk was blood once upon a time, treif, non-kosher animal blood, and somehow it miraculously transforms into this new thing as musk. Can we eat it? V'haravra meir haya oser oto be'achila mipnei chashash dam. Since its origin is blood, and if its origin is blood, it's treated as blood, and you're not allowed to eat it, even though now it has been transformed into something else. And here is where it becomes important. V'harav Rabbeinu Yonah kasav, Rabbeinu Yonah writes, the efshar lateit bo tam v'loma de pirsha be'almahu. This is no longer blood. Afal pisha metchila hayadam, even though originally it was blood. Lo chayshina lacha, it doesn't matter. And now come the three most important words you need to remember when trying to answer the question about transgender, I think. The Rabbeinu Yonah introduces a premise which later becomes adopted by a lot of poskim. I would say they count in the hundreds. The premise is these three words. The basar hashta as linen. Halakha does not require one to research origin. Halakha does not require one to go to a lab and identify the makeup of whatever it is this encounters. True, this musk thingy was blood once upon a time, but we judge things by their current status, by what we encounter. This Rabbeinu Yonah becomes applied to a lot of different halachot, so it's not like limited to this particular question. This becomes its own halakhic formula, which says basar hashta azlinan. And what I want to conjecture, what I want to put out there, and I'm very confident that that it's right, but I understand if someone might disagree with me. To me, that answered the question of surgical gender alteration. If someone surgically changes their physiology, it is indeed halachically valid, because Rabbeinu Yonah has established the premise of basar hashta azlinan. We determine things by what we see when we encounter them. We are not obligated to research origin. So for me, the answer is, if someone has surgically altered, particularly like bottom surgery, the answer is that is halachically valid, because Rabbeinu Yonah has established the premise of basar hashta azlina. And I'm saying this halacha l'maisa. So for me, if someone asks me, my answer is yes, surgery has halachic validity. Now here comes a funny piece, right? So we're talking now about, so to speak, bottom surgery, full surgery. What happens with, I'm sorry, so before I move on, here is proof, right? When someone has cochlear implants, that's considered hearing. When someone has a surgically implanted arm, that's considered valid in halakha. So, would anybody say that this young man on the left, if they were Jewish, can't put on tefillin because they don't have hands? Of course they have hands. They have new hands that have been surgically created. So what does it matter whether before it was something else, now it's something different? And of course, we can get into the specifics of gender transition surgery and the different kinds, which I'm not going to get into tonight. But clearly in halakha, alternative modes of body limbs, right? Alternative functions of body limbs has halakhic validity. What happens if it's partial transition? Oh, I'm sorry. You know what? Maybe I'll come back to this. This is the complicated proof, which I'm not sure I have time to that. Yeah, I'll come back to that later, maybe. Can't promise you, but if you're interested, I definitely will tell you this afterwards. It's a fascinating proof. What happens to partial surgery? So here is where it gets very funny, I have to say, really funny. Because there are two poskim who were asked about partial surgery, right? Typically, when someone has, so to speak, what's called top surgery and not bottom surgery. And their response to me is actually funny, I have to say. Why? Because the Gemara does discuss the issue of male milk, right? Male breast milk. So this posek says, look, if someone has male breast milk, they have breasts. And if that's considered male, obviously you see that partial transition is invalid. And I think that this proof is absolutely ludicrous. When the Gemara talks about male breast milk, it's not talking about a man who grew breasts and expresses full-fledged breast milk. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about a person, and it kind of happens sometimes, who has some kind of fluid that can be expressed from their body. We're not talking about people who had full-fledged breast transition. So I think that proof is funny. And then the other proof, which I think is funny too, is this is from actually a pretty prominent rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Yaakov Ariel. Rabbi Yaakov Ariel says, the Gemara discusses whether a woman who has a beard is allowed to shave her beard, right? Because a man is not allowed to completely, fully shave their beard with a razor. And the question in the Gemara is, what happens if a woman has a beard? This is a picture of apparently a very prominent, on the right, of a very prominent woman who had a very serious, elaborate beard. The Gemara concludes that this woman is not included in the prohibition of shaving one's beard. And this rabbi says, look, the woman has a beard. She has hormonal transition. Why don't we consider her a man? Must be that partial transition is invalid. Once again, I think this proof is not at all compelling, not at all interested, not at all convincing, because again, the Gemara is not talking there about someone who hormonally changed their body. The Gemara talks about an anomalous case that you would see in Coney Island of a woman who has grown some hair. They're fully female, they consider themselves female, and they have some extra facial hair. The Gemara is not talking about someone who intentionally and deliberately transitioned their body and altered their body, at least some body parts. I think both of those proofs are really irrelevant to our conversation, have nothing to do with the question of the, so to speak, status of partial surgery. The next question, of course, is, as I mentioned, Midrash and Kabbalah. While the Talmud knows nothing of gender transition, it is extremely prevalent in Kabbalah and in Midrash. Just two of many examples is Isaac. According to the Midrash, Isaac was born a man with a female body, a female neshama, so to speak, which is why Yitzchak was not able to get pregnant. Yitzchak was really female. And only after the Akedah have they changed into male. Similarly, the Midrash talks about Dinah and Joseph, how Dinah originally was male, Joseph was female, and for various reasons, which I'm not going to get into right now, God switched their gender. God switched their gender. So in the Midrash, in Kabbalah, there is pretty common for them to talk about gender transition. But again, it begs the question of, does that have halakhic validity or not? Does it have any halakhic status? So to pause midway, what do we have so far? What we have so far is as follows. Other than Rabbeinu Hananel, who we saw before, who talks about a person who alters their body, there's really nothing in the earlier sources that talk about transition. What's the status of transition? Which forces us to look to secondary sources, to secondary places. And the place we go to is Androgynous. Androgynous proves to us that it would seem on the surface that rabbinic gender is physiological. Rabbinic gender is physiological, right? That's why the Androgynous poses a problem for them. The Androgynous has the anatomy of a male and a female. What are they? But as we said, the question is, can one change that? Okay, fine. A penis makes one male, a vagina makes one female. What happens if a person has changed that? Does that kind of have halakhic validity? As I said, for me, the Rabbeinu Yonah is the answer. The Rabbeinu Yonah says, Basar hashta azlinan, we follow their current status for halakha, no matter what it is. So to me, that is evident that surgical alteration is valid. Partial surgery, there is no evidence to the contrary. The fact that the Gemara talks about a male who has milk has nothing to do with our question. The fact that the Gemara talks about a woman who has a beard has nothing to do with our question. So that leaves the question of partial surgery. But more importantly, we need to answer the second, more complicated question. Is physiology siman or siba? As I said earlier, right? Is the penis what makes someone a male and vagina that makes someone female? Or no, is the penis evidence of maleness? Is the vagina evidence of femaleness? And why would that matter? As I said, what happens if there is strong, compelling evidence to the contrary? What happens if someone comes along to us and says, I understand my body is female, but I'm telling you deep down, my gender dysphoria makes me feel very strongly male. Is that sufficient? In other words, can there be something that would negate, so to speak, the evidence of the body, the evidence of the physiology. Once again, obviously you're not going to find crystal clear, explicit evidence, but I think I have evidence in the affirmative. I think I can prove to you that at least according to some poskim, the answer is affirmative. What do I mean by that? There is evidence to suggest that at least according to some poskim, gender is not exclusively physiological. I'll share that with you, and hopefully in the question and answer, you can tell me this was very convincing, or I have no idea what in the world you are talking about. Both are valid suggestions. Okay, so let's take a look. What do we have? Okay. You remember the Magen Avraham, right? The Magen Avraham I mentioned earlier says that an androgynous escalates, right? An androgynous transitions back and forth from one to the other. There are times that they are male and there are times that they're female. And that begs the question of, how do we know what they are? How do we know whether they are male or they're female? So there's a significant voice within the commentators who say the following. And let's remember, we're talking about someone who has a penis and a vagina, and they still are one or the other during different times. How do we determine that? So the Pri Hasada is a 19th century Hungarian posek, says the following. The ha'inyan hikach. Here is how it works. The be'emet tekef kishenoled yesh lo zachrod v'yesh lo nekevut, right? An androgynous is someone who has female genitalia and male genitalia. But then how do they escalate? What determines the escalation? Here is how it works, right? B'chodesh echad gavar koach hazachrut. 1 month, their maleness is more dominant, more prone and more prevalent. And then 1 month, their femininity is more prone, more dominant, and that determines their gender status. So the month that they are considered male because their maleness is more prominent, they still have a vagina. And nevertheless, there are things that can be so compellingly convincing that they can override the evidence of the physiology, right? And similarly to Tiferet Israel, again, a contemporary of the Pri Hasada in Poland, very prominent commentator on Mishnah, says the same thing. Afshar the Pam koach hazachrot shebo gover upam koach hanakevot. For me, and there's a lot of other poskim who use that language as well. To me, that's proof that at least when we get to the later 19th, 20th centuries, there starts to be a recognition that gender is not physiologically based, actually. The physiology is symptomatic of the gender, but the physiology does not determine the gender, which is why these poskim that you see in front of you can talk about the word koach hazachrut. You remember, as I told you before, the key word you need to remember? These two words are the key words to remember when thinking, do all the poskim think that physiology is cause or symptom? Well, apparently, according to these poskim, the answer is no. For them, there can be things that override the physiology. Now, what are those things? That's going to be a question for us to determine. Like, I mean, what are the parameters? When can one say, oh, I am a body of a female, but I feel male? What does feel male mean in a way that's authentic, that has integrity, and that's sensitive? That will become the big question for us. How do we determine, kind of criteria to determine what does it take to say, oh, this is sufficient evidence to be able to override the evidence of physiology. So, in conclusion, what do you need to take home tonight? What do you need to put in your backpack when to think going forward about a question of gender transition? So the following is what we need to think. 3 terms that we need to think. Basar hashta, right? Rabbeinu Yonah seems to think that halacha is not a research body. Halacha does not go back in, backwards to kind of determine what was and what happened prior. Halacha determines things based on what they encounter. So therefore, even if we will assume that gender is physiological, it can still be altered. And if you alter your physiology, then that's the gender that you are, based on the fact that basar hashta. So that's one thing to put in your knapsack. Second thing to put in your knapsack is the question of, is physiology cause or is physiology symptom? Siman or siba. Anytime when we ask the question about gender transition and we kind of look, halakha talks about physiology. Is physiology cause or is physiology symptom? And finally, the last thing you need to take along in your knapsack as you leave tonight and want to kind of continue to further reflect on this question is the last 2 words that we saw. Koach zachrut and koach nikfut, right? By the time the 19th century comes along, and perhaps there is a little evidence a little bit earlier as well, I still have to look a little bit further. By the time the 19th century comes along, we start seeing language in the poskim that refers to male and female by something other than the physiology. Now, again, it's a very complicated word, koach. We don't know what exactly does koach zachrut, a male energy, right? A male power and a female. We don't know what that is. But certainly for them, there was something other than the physiology that determined gender. So, in conclusion, here's where I stand. Like I said before, there are 3 questions: mechitza, gender-based mitzvot, and when it comes to marital issues. I am more comfortable in one case than in the other to go all the way. What do I mean by that? If someone has physically altered their genitalia from one to the other, I'm convinced that there is enough evidence to argue that that's a full-fledged, 100% halakhically valid transition across the board for all 3 criteria, for all 3 tiers. Yes, they'll be in a mechitza of the gender that they are now. They will be bound by the mitzvahs based on the gender that they are now. And so too, when it comes to marital issues, their current genitalia will determine their marital issues. However, in the second case, right, the koach zachrut, when someone keeps their body the way they were born, but somehow argues that I am telling you that this is incorrect. I feel female, even though my body is male. I feel male, even though my body is female. Of course, I have no problem relying on that from mechitza. I have no problem relying on that when it comes to gender-based mitzvot. When it comes to marital issues, at the moment, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable to take that leap and say that even for marital issues, that's sufficient. In other words, let me be very blunt and very explicit. So if someone is born male, has a male body, but convincingly argues for gender dysphoria that they really are female, would them being with another male be considered homosexuality or heterosexuality? That I'm not so comfortable to go yet. Maybe over time, I will be comfortable evolving my thinking, but that's where I'm not yet comfortable to go to. But other than that, I feel pretty strongly that the language of koach zachrut, koach nikfus, gives us the license. And again, I want to stress one last thing before I finish. Modern Orthodox halakha never strived, right? Never aspired for universal acceptance, universal halakhic acceptance. We don't say that, oh, XYZ is okay because all the poskim think it's okay. That was not the criteria. That was not the standard. That was not the aspiration. Quite frankly, if you want to talk about women learning the Gemara, it's not universal. But that's not what we're aspiring for. We're aspiring for being able with integrity to argue there is sufficient basis in the poskim for X, Y, and Z. That's my goal tonight. My goal tonight is to prove, and my goal with my tshuva is to prove that at least some of the poskim accept physical transition as valid, and some of the poskim are cognizant of gender dysphoria being a valid, legitimate thing. It has a strong basis in the poskim, and therefore one who wants to rely on it has on what to rely on. Yasher koach, and open to questions. Perhaps, I don't know, Steve or Meira or someone wants to referee the questions, or how should we do this?
Okay, so firstly, thank you very much. We have many questions. We've collected a few of them, and we'll see how far we can get. I think that among the questions that I put them in the chat for you, so you can see, but among the questions that I think I want to kind of address first is a question of Batar Hashtaz Linan as a frame. So first, someone suggested in Shabbos 91a, there's some challenge of that notion that it's misupak, and that it results in teku. I don't know. This is not, I'm familiar, but perhaps you
Let me take a look at a question quickly, but you go on in the meantime. Okay,
good. And so I guess the question would be, given that there are, this is a frame of reference very specifically on a particular issue, there would be pushback that would claim that Basar, Azlin, and Hashta, is too broad a assumption to adopt for such a thing as significance as gender. And so I kind of want to ask a deeper question that, as you look in, in the Gemara, you can consider, and I think the younger generation keep asking me this question broadly. Is it possible that the entire frame of gender is changing in front of our eyes in a way that there's, that it's not like whether or not we're looking at it now or looking at it then, but we're asking a broad question on whether or not the determinations around gender are useful in a contemporary world. On some level, feminism challenges what gender is. In another level, transgender questions what gender is. In a third level that we didn't address tonight, the non-binary community is asking what is gender. And so I guess I want to put forth, whether or not you want to deal with the Shabbos 91 question, is the deeper question about the meaning of gender. And perhaps this is for next time when you deal with the theological implications. But I want to kind of open up the possibility that 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 in a way this discussion is challenging for people for whom gender is overdetermined in the tradition, and they want to figure out how to live in it given that circumstance.
Right. So let me say just a couple of things. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that we are creating new criteria other than asking questions that people didn't get around to ask in previous generations. My friend Mark Shapiro has this very beautiful idea. He says, why is it that when you look to earlier poskim, they talk about kashrut, they talk about hilchas nida, they don't talk about feminism, they don't talk about other things that we talk about? And his answer is very simple. a 18th, 19th century rabbi was preoccupied most of their time with making sure the chicken is kosher, right? Because the woman needed the rabbi to make sure, to kind of tell them that the chicken is kosher, because otherwise she wouldn't have food to feed her children. And that's what occupied. Yeah, it's Mark Shapiro from Scranton, correct? That's what occupied the rabbi's mind for the most of the time, and they didn't get around to ask these big questions. Whereas we thank God, live in a much more prosperous society, and people don't bog down rabbis with chicken questions, and it frees us up to ask questions that have not been asked before. And that's the process of halakha all the time, is that we go back and we don't make up new halachot. We just find out that there are lenses we haven't thought of, lenses that we have not considered, that we all of a sudden now bring to the conversation and bring to the table. So that's what I would say, number one. Number two, I think, Steve, you're 100% right. My conversation addressed a very limited, very narrow window of this conversation, which is people who still live within the binaries, but they're moving from one to the other. What happens with this new category of non-binary? That's kind of the next stage of this conversation, right? Which is a whole nother question. And, if we remember earlier tonight, I mentioned there are those who say an androgynous is birya bifnei atzma. So there is room already in the Gemara for a third gender other than male and female, and perhaps that would be the next stage in this conversation. But you're right. For now, I think that we are trying to upgrade the conversation of gender beyond the emotional and instinctual. Like I said, if you look to most of the poskim, and for those of you who are interested, perhaps Meira can post it again. I shared also a much more extensive source sheet. You will look and see for yourself that until recently, until the Dor Tapuchot came along, and others, and even the Dor Tapuchot to some degree suffers from a pretty extensive emotional and instinctual reaction rather than a textual reaction. And hopefully we can move this conversation along. And when we exhaust this conversation, we'll also have to move on to the next stage of the conversation of what happens to non-binary people. The person who mentioned the Gemara in Shabbos 61a, if you feel comfortable, and I don't know, Steve, if that's okay, if they can elaborate. I don't have the time right now to look up that Gemara.
I think it was 91a, but why don't you do that offline, because it might not be actually so directly relevant. So we can.
Okay. Any other questions?
So the other question has to do with the in a way the limited categories that you raised, and I think in the mixed, or is it, I would say, in the non-cisgender world. So there's genetic sex, there's not gonadal sex, hormonal, there's genitalia, there's social categories. You didn't even mention that as well, is that there's social sexual frames. In other words, it's not what the individual thinks or feels, or even what their body says or what their hormones say, but what other society recognizes. So there are many more frames for struggling to make sense of this. And I guess someone put that out as a kind of question, did you mean to narrow it, or were you just being kind of creating, more simple frames?
Thank you. I appreciate it. I very much want to answer that question. So what we're working with now is, and I put it in the chat, and then there's a term that I've not mentioned before, and I'll elaborate what I mean by that. We have two terms in halakha that we have to work with, right? One is koach zachrut, like I said before, right? There's a thing as koach zachrut. And then the other word that we have not talked about, because we didn't get around to it, is that in Kabbalah, people talk about a male with a female neshama, or a female with a male neshama. if ever there were ambiguous terms, these two are the ones, right? So I limited myself only to narrow the conversation, but really what I meant to do is, okay, now we have an open field and we need to kind of start doing the secondary work of creating clear criteria for what is within the kind of boundaries of koach and what's outside the boundaries of koach, number one. Number two, how do you translate neshama into 21st century parlance, right? They used, oh, that person had a female neshama. What would that mean in our contemporary language, in contemporary nomenclature? Does that mean that they associate the society, like all the things that you mentioned, Steve? Are they subsumed under neshama? Are they subsumed under koach? Some of them will be, some of them won't be, and that will be the next generation of work, is to kind of start fleshing out, as it were, what are the parameters of koach, right? What fits into under koach, what doesn't fit under koach? And I guess I want to stress just that the second category for me is much more exciting, because neshama is a code word for something. Right? When a Reb Chaim Vital, the student of the Arizal, sees someone and he says, yes, I know they look male. I tell you they have a neshama of a female. What really was going on in their minds when they were arguing that this person is something other than when they look? What is neshama translate into? Exactly. Any other questions?
Yes, Frida asks an interesting question. If a man transitions to a woman and leaves his wife, does he need to give her a get?
Right. That's a great one. So actually, that's a problematic issue, and here's why. Because in the chat, I kind of kept on seeing people almost yelling at me. Sometimes you can yell in writing and you hear it, right? In the chat, someone kept on yelling at me, Tzitz Eliezer, Tzitz Eliezer, Tzitz Eliezer, Tzitz Eliezer. I think it was you, Thomas, and I appreciate it. We're good friends, but let me explain what I'm talking about. Oftentimes people reference the Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer is Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was a posek in Israel who passed away a couple of years ago, contemporary posek. He's probably one of the top-notch poskim who unfortunately very few people know about. He has like 20 volumes of tshuvot on almost every topic. He talks extensively about the issue of transgender, and that's his case. Frida's case is the case that he talks about, right? A man and woman were married to each other. One day the man transitions from male to female, and the question was whether the woman needs a get or not. And the Tzitz Eliezer says no. So most people say, look, the Tzitz Eliezer clearly accepts, bottom surgery as legitimate. He said that this man has become a woman. The problem is that that's a misread of the Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer does not take a stand on the transgender question. The Tzitz Eliezer takes a stand on the marriage question. And basically, excuse my bluntness for a moment, all the Tzitz Eliezer is saying is a husband without a penis is no longer a husband for what purposes a husband is, right? You got marriage for conjugal purposes. And if that man is no longer able to kind of fulfill those conjugal commitments, I mean, it's a little blunt language, even the Tzitz Eliezer. He says it's more like mitat habal rather than a get, right? If the husband dies, then the woman is free. This, for him, is considered equivalent to mitat habal. Why is that? And what happens with impotence? Would I say the same thing about impotence or not? Those are good questions. But again, the Tzitz Eliezer, for the most part, there are other tshuvot that we can talk about. The Tzitz Eliezer is talking about marriage more so than he's talking about transgender.
Okay. I think it's an interesting question, though, Rabbi, because we would all know many frames of reference by which a person has a penis but cannot father children.
Yes, exactly. Right. I mean, would the Tzitz Eliezer say someone is impotent?
So the likelihood is the absence of a penis is more meaningful than the absence, for example, of testicles.
Right. Exactly. Correct.
Okay, good. So I don't know why, and that might actually shed more light on identity than you're admitting.
Yep, for sure.
Okay.
For sure.
I'm eager to kind of open this up, but I want to make sure that I haven't missed anything here, because by the time we open it up, we have to turn off the tape. So let me finish with one just, a broad question that I think is important to ask. So might it be possible to imagine that, as you suggested from the Dor Tapuchot, that representation is sufficient for D'Rabbanan prohibitions? If it looks like a duck, it's a duck for Rabbanans. And therefore, someone who convincingly belongs to the female community because they appear so can sit with the women. No matter what the morphology is, we're not asking them to undress. However, might it be claimed that anything that impacts the body in a substantive way, whether it's hormones or whether it's top surgery or bottom surgery, anything that signals that I am actively shifting my body. And the reason this is so is because the bottom surgery is more complicated and not as successfully accomplished in many circumstances. And people are hesitant to do it for all kinds of health reasons, but they were willing to do something to their body. And that attempt to shift the body is sufficient to claim that they've basically done what you're asking them to do.
Yeah. I mean, you're asking all the follow-up questions that requires more work, right? I mean, again, I've set up, so to speak, binaries, right? Full surgical transition on the one hand, or zero surgical transition, but some kind of secondary evidence counter to the physiology. What happens when there's kind of more of this and less of that? And again, I don't have the numbers, and I think the numbers are going to be important because halakha can't survive in this gray zone. Halakha needs to work towards concretizing the specifics. And it will take time. It will take time. And again, the problem is there are tiers of severity, so to speak. Tefillin, yes and no, is a much lower bar than when it comes to questions of whom can I be with and so on and so forth. So again, I don't have the answer because, like I said, it's in its infancy. It's in its infancy.
In related to the shiur last week, I thought of something that ties to this that's interesting. Let's say that if a person says I'm gay, then the halakha shifts because we don't want to force a gay person to marry a woman against his desire, and we even permit things that might not be permissible to a straight man. But how would you prove you're gay? You see, you can attest to it. You can say, I've felt this way all my life, but does halakha need some evidence that you haven't made it up? And part of the challenge is that this intersection, which you, I think, introduced your shiur very beautifully with, which is we're dealing, if we were other religions, we could only talk about the soul. If we were scientists, we could only talk about the body. But here we are as Jews, and we have this ensouled physicality, all of which is meaningful. We can't deny the body fundamental definitional meaning, nor can we claim that the soul doesn't have a part in it. And so I leave us with the complexity of dealing with a human being that is a mix of will and soul and representation and image and relationship that is not easy to pull apart. And we honor you and all your work and are eagerly looking to the monograph coming up. It will help to clarify some of this and bring other, Torah scholars and poskim to, in their response to you, engage in the conversation and maybe support, challenge, and create more opportunities for engagement. So thank you.
But let me quickly respond to what you're saying, then we'll open it for a few minutes for questions. But I put in the chat something, and that's actually a conversation that I had recently with, some of you might know, Angela Bachdel, who is the rabbi of Central Synagogue and a very dear friend, and we're talking about a different context. These three things that you see in the chats, right, are the evolution of what's considered evidence in halakha, right? How do we determine facts, right? So the initial stage was edut. The only way we establish fact is through two witnesses. And when it came to aguna, That's how we determine. If two witnesses can testify that X died, Mrs. X can get married. Over time, this evolved, and we said, no, simanim is enough. What does simanim mean? If you can point to some kind of pimple, or some kind of, birthmark, that's enough. And from there, we've moved on to tviyat ayin. What is tviyat ayin? Tviyat ayin means I see it, I know it, I'm telling you, I can identify it as my husband, right? The question similarly here would be, right, what is the kind of standard and the bar for determining that, right? Can we evolve the criteria for determining this question, right? Is it someone that needs to have proof? Is it someone who kind of says, I can tell this person indeed gives the impression that they're male or female? Is that too dangerous? Those are questions, but clearly halakha evolved over the years in terms of how do we determine and establish fact. We can't always have the top-notch criteria of absolute, unequivocal, undoubtful. In fact, even edut is not 100% definitive. Two peoples can conspire, and still we've determined we gotta make a reasonable bar in order to determine X and Y so that people can live.
Thank you so much. I just want to just reiterate that this is an incredible honor and a very exciting moment in sharing your Torah with our community and beyond. I want to thank specifically the Pragers and Frida and others who've supported this effort and who funded it in with great generosity, and many others as well.